Well, that election happened. Let's talk about COINTELPRO.
Watch out! You might get what you're after. Cool babies, strange but not a stranger.
This story isn't actually about COINTELPRO. You just need to understand what that is to understand the story I want to tell you. Here's a hint. It involves Richard Nixon. But first, let's back up to 1956 when the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, institutes the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. Initially, this program's aim was to disrupt the operations of the Communist Party in the United States, and seeing that this was the Cold War, if the program had ended at that, the general political perception of it would be much more favorable. It would probably be remembered much more fondly. Instead, to quote the Senate investigation that this all ends in, it is remembered as a vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association, on the theory that preventing the growth of dangerous groups and the propagation of dangerous ideas would protect the national security and deter violence. The official branches of COINTELPRO often overlapped with each other, but broke out into 5 main groups: the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, white hate groups, black nationalists, and the New Left. For an example on that overlap, the FBI maintained that Puerto Rican independence groups were their own specific target. And this overlap is something that the United States Senate noticed as well. Even the names of the later programs had no clear definition. The Black Nationalist program included a great number of organizations you might not today characterize as black nationalist. The Nonviolent Southern Christian Leadership Conference was labeled as a black nationalist hate group. Nor could anyone even define New Left, except as more or less an attitude. The Communist Party USA program targeted not only party members, but also civil rights leaders allegedly under communist influence or simply not anti-communist. The New Left programs targeted entire colleges in the United States. COINTEL was the program that led the FBI writing a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. telling him to kill himself. It was what led to Fred Hampton. It was a program that would be considered intolerable in a democratic society, even if all of the targets had been involved in violent activity. Now, there were some common tactics employed by the FBI under the cover of COINTELPRO, and some of these included distributing propaganda to these groups and inserting them into the media, setting rival groups against each other, and encouraging gang warfare, to include what is known as the snitch jacket, where they paint people or groups as being part of the FBI so that, they can be taken care of. Feeding information and targets to friendly groups, targeting family, friends, and associates, informing employers of both real and completely made-up information, selectively using law enforcement, which included sending information, real or not, to judges and prosecutors, and everything in between. The dragnet became so large that it wasn't just groups like the Weathermen, or the Ku Klux Klan, or the Nation of Islam, or the John Birch Society, which became ensnared. If you simply held a differing political opinion than that of the conservative median, then you were likely to be targeted. Like East Germany's Stasi is generally used as the benchmark for a repressive state police. And one of the methods that the Stasi used to control East German citizens, suppress dissent, and all around just ruin people's lives, was by making it look like dissidents were actually Stasi informants. This could be accomplished in a variety of manners, but one of them was, taking compromising photos of dissidents staged in a way to make it look like they were happily cooperating with the Ministry for State Security, and then circulating them among dissident groups. That sure sounds terrible, doesn't it? And that was just one small part of COINTELPRO. Now, there was a key difference. In East Germany, the Stasi were said to act within the state's authority, while in the United States, the FBI was said to have exceeded it, which for all intents and purposes can be a distinction without a difference to a dissident. It doesn't matter if the state is allowed to or not. Just that they did it. Which brings us back to COINTELPRO. It's one of the biggest dick moves in American history, and roughly 90% of Rage Against the Machine's discography is about it. And in 1970, Richard Nixon asked J. Edgar Hoover to implement his own plan, one that was signed off on by the heads of the CIA, the NSA, and the DIA. It would give official presidential authority to the actions that the FBI had already been doing and expand them. And Hoover said no. Wait, what? All of the agencies supported the options selected by the president. So did all the members of Mr. Hoover's staff who worked on the report. He'd fire them if he knew this. By the summer of 1970, the chiefs of the principal U.S. security agencies, J. Edgar Hoover for the FBI, Richard Helms for the CIA, Admiral Noel Gaylor for the National Security Agency, and General Donald B. Bennett for the Defense Intelligence Agency, had crafted a plan to track down on domestic dissidents as requested by President Nixon. Known as the Huston Plan after the White House aide most intimately involved with the details of pushing for its creation. It, in the words of Senator Charles Mathias, caused 5 days in 1970 that the fundamental guarantees of the Bill of Rights were suspended. During those 5 days, authoritarian rule had superseded the Constitution. Oh yeah, spoiler alert, the entire plan that was too much for J. Edgar Hoover? It was implemented, and formed the basis for one of the articles of impeachment drafted against Nixon. When Richard Nixon came to office, the country was volatile. 2 high-profile political assassinations had just occurred, and riots were becoming a political constant. The country had just watched police beat protesters at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, and the unpopularity of the Vietnam War was reaching its height. As summarized by journalist Garrett Graff, as the upheaval rippled through politics, voters, or at least many Southern voters, turned against the liberal dreams of the New Deal and the Great Society. The peace, love, and understanding of the Age of Aquarius that had begun to characterize 60s culture turned into something darker and more selfish by the end of the decade. Lyndon Johnson's dreams of a war on poverty became Nixon's welfare mess. The celebration of Brown v. Board of Education became Northern fights over school busing. White fears of drugs, black militants, and the New Left became enshrined in calls for law and order. An economy that had soared since the generation educated under the GI Bill, bringing millions of white families in suburban, middle-class Cleaver family bliss, sputtered with unemployment and inflation. America had dominated the post-world stage for 2 decades, but now, the great democratic superpower reckoned with its own internal dissension and weakness alone. There was fear that the so-called New Left was ready to spark a revolution over the broken promises of Brown v. Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, and gender equality largely remaining out of reach. The response, what was needed, according to Nixon, was a phrase that has come to dominate American politics ever since: law and order. Nixon had run on a platform of law and order to restore peace not just overseas, but at home as well. The start of 1970 coincided with a worrisome rise of violence, both foreign and domestic. The evolutionary circle of violent dissent spawned an ugly offshoot, the urban underground of political terrorists urging murder and bombing, Nixon recalled in his own memoirs. Airline hijacking swelled, terror groups formed, New left radicals launched bombing campaigns, and American cities were overcome with bomb threats. New York City saw more than 400 of them in one 24-hour period during Nixon's first year. And as Nixon settles into the presidency, things don't get better. Controversial decisions about the Vietnam War, along with American conduct in it, results in things such as the Kent State shootings. Tin soldiers and Nixon coming is an apt pulse check of what American dissidents believed, and what the Nixon administration believed would be the inciting impetus of a violent revolution. At the same time, however, relations between the FBI and all the other intelligence agencies had frayed. The CIA had, in fact, at one point asked the FBI to pass along intelligence about the weathermen to them, and the FBI had basically told the CIA to get bent. This brings us to the Huston Plan, which was essentially Nixon asking all of his children to play nice and violate the out of American civil liberties. Concocted over the course of a few months in the spring and summer of 1970, the plan had been to present a simple checklist of recommendations to the president to sign off on. Hoover was in fact placed at the head of the commission that came up with this plan in what was a goal to placate his ego. The commission came up with, mostly declassified for the first time in 2017, the following recommendations for Nixon's approval: an intensification of electronic surveillance, removing restrictions on mail covers, literally reading people's mail, that's what that means. Something involving communications intelligence, literally this part is still classified, changing something about illegal entries. Once again, still classified, but what we see is a desire to expand upon what was currently being done. An expansion and monitoring of college campuses, and permissibility of using military undercover agents. There was just one problem. Hoover didn't want to go along with these recommendations. On every single one of them, Hoover made sure to note that the FBI, read Hoover, objected to parts. And I'm going to be honest, when I was writing this video, I thought this was going to be the point upon which everything turned. But the more I researched, the more I wrote, the more I realized this part is just boring. So I'll make it quick. There are many reasons Hoover didn't want to go along with this, and a lot of them had to do with the fact that Hoover understood that because of the ongoing COINTELPRO, it was likely that his reputation would come crashing down around him at any time. He wasn't worried about the rights of Americans. He was worried about getting caught. Or in his words, "For years and years I have approved opening mail and other similar operations, but no, it is becoming more and more dangerous and we are apt to get caught. I'm not opposed to doing this, providing someone higher than myself approves of it." This is what leads to that funny memo about Hoover firing his own staff. Everyone involved in this saw zero reason not to simply plow ahead and have Nixon give the okay. Even the Hoover balking was easily sidestepped. Huston simply wrote a memo on direction from Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, that restrictions were terminated on mail opening, break-ins, black bag jobs. There were now loosened constraints, with details redacted, on forms of electronic surveillance. It ordered increased intelligence gathering on college campuses and restrictions removed which hampered that. Agencies were to submit budget requests to cover the work, and a committee would be formed to oversee the spying. America's top intelligence agencies now had a blank check to use against American civil liberties with the backing of the White House. There was just one problem. Nobody had told the Attorney General. Until Hoover did. The most insane part about this curtailing of Americans' rights by decree is that it was more or less undone by what was a temper tantrum. Furious that he had been cut out of the process, Hoover went to his nominal boss, Attorney General John Mitchell. Yes, the entire time Hoover was jockeying over the best way to violate civil rights, Hoover had been acting independently and without the knowledge of his boss. That just really goes to show how Hoover and even the Nixon White House viewed Hoover's power. After Hoover met with Mitchell, Mitchell then the same day went and spoke with Nixon, and then the next day to the heads of the intelligence agencies. Huston would describe Mitchell's talk as such. You can't do this. Hoover's got all the cards. I mean, all he has to do is leak this stuff and you're in a totally untenable position. And that was it for the Huston Plan. CIA Director Helms recorded that Mitchell told them to stand down. A CIA routing slip from Helms dated July 28th indicates he sent back the Huston directive that day. Other agency directors did the same. The Huston Plan had been in effect for 5 days, officially. Just long enough to cover one of the articles of impeachment drawn up against Nixon when details of it leaked out to the press. But it kept coming back. As the Church Committee investigation uncovered, many parts of the Huston Plan stayed and were implemented. And then Nixon was famously caught on tape saying that he wanted the Brookings Institution broken into because he thought they had a leaked file. And what does he reference?
Now, you remember Houston's plan implemented.
But couldn't we go over, now Brookings has no right to have classified that?
You know, I mean, I want it implemented on a thievery basis. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
Watergate dominated the headlines about Nixon because it was the clearest and most easily understood part of the White House horrors. But as all the leaking on Watergate is happening, so too is the country finding about COINTELPRO, the Huston Plan, MK Ultra. And that's the legacy of this entire time period I want to focus on. Because when making this election follow-up video about Nixon, I had to really narrow in the scope. If I did Nixon prepare for 2025, I wouldn't be able to finish producing and editing and then release this video until 2026. But just this little amount has probably multiple times throughout this video caused you to go, wait, isn't that what the government is currently doing? And yes, Hoover and Nixon saw their reputations destroyed when they saw what they had been the last of in a long chain of abuses. But even in this story, that chain didn't end there. In fact, it never has.